Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming today to Wolfson's first roundtable discussion for COP26 at Wolfson. Today we have an amazing selection of speakers for you in front of you, and there are some in the audience who are participating from 5 o'clock. First, I just want to welcome you all. Thank you all so much for coming. Today we're going to be talking about human rights policy and law in the context of climate change and sustainability more broadly. Our host today is Helle Porsdam, who's a visiting fellow of Wolfson College, who has very kindly agreed to moderate the beginning of this discussion. And then once we have these three speakers in front of us, there's Elizabeth Wild, Josh Matthews, and Natasha Kirsting. Thank you all very much for joining. We will then move to an audience Q&A for 15 minutes. Global Pact for the Environment and Alice Adamy, who is a Wolfson College PhD student who has very kindly invited them along. We'll then have an hour discussion with some people who will be joining on Zoom as well. And then we'll have a half an hour roundtable, at which point we'll end, and then people are free to leave. But if you want to stay on for half an hour, we'll be continuing to 7 o'clock. So with that, I'd like to pass over to Helle to introduce the first speaker, and we shall get going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. Welcome to everybody. As Charlie said, I'm a visiting professor here at Cambridge from the University of Copenhagen. So it's a pleasure to be a part of this, and let's just get right into it. Elizabeth, you are the first speaker, so please, you're going to tell us about human rights, why a just transition matters.
Yes, hello everyone. Great to be back in Cambridge. I did my master's here a few years ago and spent many happy hours in this very hall. So my first slide probably could say it all if I were only given 1 minute, and that is that we don't just want an energy transition, but we want a just energy transition, and by that I mean a fair one. So I'm just going to give you a few thoughts on that and then pass over to the other speakers who have a lot more in-depth remarks to make. So moving to the next slide, Charlie. I wanted to find, rather than a lot of words, just a picture to try and describe what I mean by a just transition. This is, in fact, quite an old picture. It's called the Oxfam donut. It was created around about 2012, and although it wasn't created for the purposes of talking about climate change only, you will see climate change at the top, but the purpose of the Oxfam donut is the premise that you should make sure that there is a safe and just space for humanity, and that means not busting environmental limits, and as we all know, we are in the process of doing that in very many different ways. But the important part for my points is that Oxfam also said, nor should you go beneath the social floor. In other words, there must be a minimum of social standards and human rights standards, because otherwise you could have a situation where you work very, very hard at the environmental issues and you don't really work very hard at the social and human rights issues, which will not go away as we green the global economy. And in fact, some new social and human rights issues could be created and some could be exacerbated. And that leads me on to my next slide, Charlie. My point is that only green is not good enough. We have to think about the social and human rights ramifications of moving towards net zero. And rather than just listening to my viewpoints on this, I've given 4 factual examples. And these are things that people have quite often just said to me over the years, or you hear them in the media. The first one is natural fibres are better than synthetics, right? We should all be wearing and using natural fibres and not using synthetic ones, which can be made with fossil fuels. So my answer to that is, well, yes, but there is a but, and you can see what the but is there, and that's just one example, quite severe labour rights impacts associated with cotton production, for example, in some countries. So it's not a simple issue. And I think the second example says that too. You know, biofuels better than fossil fuels, absolutely. But there is evidence, independent evidence, for example, from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, that the production of biofuels in some countries leads to not only some environmental issues, such as biodiversity problems, but also can affect food production, can affect water that communities may need, both quantity and quality. So again, not a simple issue, and you can't just go all out for biofuels and say, that's absolutely fine and we don't need to think about the social impacts. Example 3, solar and wind, much better than fossil fuels, right? Absolutely, sounds great. But let's not forget that the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre did some analysis which showed that the human rights due diligence of some large clean energy companies showed some pretty serious gaps, and you can see them there. Supply chains, which you're going to talk about later, land acquisition policies, human displacement, approaches to indigenous peoples and gender equality. So quite a complicated issue. And then the last example, electric vehicles, they are great, right? But what about the labour rights issues in obtaining the raw materials like cobalt? What about the labour rights and child labour rights issues in mining all sorts of minerals that we now need for our amazing energy transformation and new technologies? So just 4 examples showing that this is pretty complicated. If we move on to the next slide, Charlie. I just wanted to illustrate, again, not just me saying that the just transition is a hot topic. Here is a list of organisations which I just collected on an internet trawl, all of whom have made pronouncements about the need for an energy transition that is fair. And you'll be happy to know that the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership is on that list. So a lot of key organisations in the international arena are making the very same assertion that I'm making. Keeping an eye on the time and moving forward again, I'm using this term just transition, but before I pass on to the next speaker, I wanted to give you a very quick view of what do people say that this means. And people, by that I mean the organisations that I listed on the previous slide. So what I did here was I just listed all the sort of little statements, expressions and wordings that many of these organisations are using when they describe what they believe the just transition is. And the ones in green are the ones that appear most often. So if you look at all the organisations' pronouncements that I have listed on the previous slide, the sorts of words they're using are very often these ones in green. You know, fair, leave no one behind, address the energy gap for everybody, not just for the rich countries, take a holistic approach, and another one is convergences. You need a convergence of technology, of government policy, and of community attitudes. So this was just to leave you at the end of my little introduction with a bit of a picture of what just transition means to many of the organisations that are now thinking about it quite seriously. I am hoping that COP26 will pay what I consider to be an appropriate amount of attention to the fact that only green is not good enough. We don't just need an energy transition, we need a just energy transition. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that was brief enough, and I'll pass on to our next speaker.
It was beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that reminder that green isn't enough in and of itself. So you set the picture beautifully, I think. Got us off to a very good start. Thank you for that. Next is Josh, who's going to talk about making sure green supply chains are just. So please.
Brilliant, thanks, and thanks, Elizabeth, for, so many topics that I think I'll try and touch on. I'll hopefully come somewhere close to what resembles a solution, or even a hint at some of the solutions. I kind of came up with this, at least the headline, before I figured out what I was really going to say, and started thinking through what some examples of green supply chains, what some of the fundamental problems with those specifically green supply chains might be. But actually, I've ended up going a bit left field, and I'm not just going to pick on green supply chains in particularly. So, give a quick bit of an intro to myself as well. So, in previous lives, was a chemical engineer, did my MPhil here at the Department for Engineering, spent a couple of years on the City Council in Cambridge as essentially the opposition portfolio holder for climate change and the city centre, and now work for HFS Research, a small research and consulting company, where I lead the coverage for sustainability in the energy and utilities industries. Obviously, supply chain factoring massively in all three. So on the topic of green supply chains, I think the example that most people come up with to start with is batteries and the electric vehicle supply chain, and thinking about all the ramifications of mining the various metals that might go into a battery. But actually far broader than that, and the more I thought about that supply chain specifically, the issues and potential solutions it was more and more obvious that they apply to any supply chain. And rather than seeing the problem as green supply chains in particularly, I think we need to look at all supply chains. There are just fundamental issues, and not just the ones that we've seen in the last few weeks or throughout the pandemic, but have existed for, well, probably since the beginning of any kind of global supply chain, on the complexity that we have today. Certainly, I mean, you think about some other examples that get headlines: the chocolate supply chain, coffee supply chain for variety of technology, chips, semiconductors, a lot of the same metals that might go into an electric vehicle battery. And then, without talking about the coal, oil and gas supply chains and the practices there, we have mining right now. We didn't suddenly invent mining for battery supply chain, certainly. So looking at the concept of any supply chain and what some of the issues are, Charlie, if you don't mind flicking onto the next slide. Got a few things here, and it's a bit wordy and a lot of numbers. I mean, almost ignore the absolute numbers and the barriers that we've got here to broader organizational sustainability across any, I think we pulled this data together looking at any sustainability factor across environmental, social, governance, ESG. But there are sort of four fundamental issues, and they translate almost perfectly into supply chains, and that's data, that's processes, it's visibility, and a dire need for collaboration in not just supply chains, but in the entire ecosystems that surround organizations and industries that are only getting more complex as the supply chains themselves become more complex. I'll sort of go through the four of them reasonably briefly. So I think data is a problem in most types of organizational change. I think one thing that's becoming very clear when we look at sustainability over the last couple of years, certainly, the barriers are starting to mimic the same barriers we've seen for 10 years plus, certainly way before I became involved and joined HFS, started looking at business, emerging technology, anything that come under the kind of horrible digital transformation umbrella. All these things that organizations aren't aligned, they have terrible data, they either don't know where the data is, or the data that they can get is either of low quality, it's not standardized, and it's not being pulled together and used in some sort of way, in some sort of integrated way that aligns to the overall company goals and the outcomes or the problems that they might want to solve. And that applies to sustainability as well. And if you think of the context of supply chains, some companies are finding it difficult enough to measure their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So direct emissions from burning fossil fuels, for example, or indirect emissions from, say, the energy brought in to power a particular process. But then as you go through the supply chain, you start, and in many cases it's difficult enough to get the data on whether it's emissions, whether it's labor practices, whether it's a variety of types that fall under the governance of the G in ESG, whether that could be cybersecurity or any kind of broader stability or resilience that business might have going into the future, certainly been exposed over the last couple of years. But as you go down through the supply chain, so your direct suppliers being tier one, as you go to their suppliers and their suppliers, that challenge becomes just exponentially greater. They'll have different availabilities of data. That data will be in different formats. They will perhaps legally be required to report in their own countries or their own industries on specific standards. Will decide sometimes which standards they want to report to if they're not legally forced to. And then it all results in a lot of, even some of the most either progressive or largest companies in the world having horribly manual and non-standardized processes. And that's where we come on to the second of the four issues, processes. So the main ones surrounding sustainability, and again, come into supply chain. So measuring, monitoring, visualization, generally being able to tell where you are as a starting point, and using data to make better decisions either on a sort of higher strategic level at the top of the company or day to day, and actually embedding sustainability data throughout a variety of those processes. So an example might be procurement. So a procurement team will be in charge of sourcing energy, packaging, corporate travel, IT, tech, variety of things. And actually getting that department the data to be able to make better decisions on we're going to procure X because it has a better rating on either its carbon footprint or its labor practices, and you can start to see the scale of the challenge. And one thing, a lot of the data that came out in this specific study centered on the problems integrating data business processes, and almost there's a lot of the time there's a fundamental disconnect between the organizational level strategy and turning that into a very specific roadmap. And for those of you who might have looked at the UK government's recent supposed roadmap to net zero and know anything about road mapping, which I think we're going to talk about tomorrow in the context of decarbonising a Cambridge college, will know that what they've presented is just not a roadmap. It's not broken down. There are not, I mean, you could argue that there are timed actions in the sense of these are the policies they're going to bring in now and again. But those policies do not align under the broader journey of getting to net zero at the very least by 2050, let alone any sort of time before that. And so turning back to the sort of organizational level strategy, turning that into roadmaps that have tangible metrics, targets that are given throughout the company to the rest of the C-suite, so whether it's the CEO turning that into targets for the chief financial officer, chief supply chain officer, procurement officer, and then bringing that down throughout the middle management into processes, into the performance metrics of anyone just going about their day-to-day job. And then when you start to come back to make that happen, you need the data, you need the various business processes within a company to be aligned. But also, that only works if you can get the data to begin with, and that's gonna everyone at all involved in a kind of corporate or organizational supply chain are now saying the same things, that we're going to need a level of collaboration throughout those supply chains and ecosystems that we just haven't seen before, be on a fundamentally new level. And there's almost a lack of trust at the minute. A lot of suppliers very hesitant, unless they're legally required to report something, are a bit hesitant sometimes in disclosing data, or they just, quite bluntly, they don't have the data at their disposal. And there's collaboration across sort of as a large firm within that supply chain, with your suppliers, your customers throughout that ecosystem. But there's also a dire need to collaborate, and this is where it comes on to the fourth point of visibility. that a lot of the visibility and the bringing together of the data, the processes, and which underpinned hopefully by collaboration will come onto a variety of technologies and platforms that companies run their operations on. So some examples you might be familiar with: SAP, Oracle, Salesforce are all turning their technologies and their platforms towards sustainability now. But quite frankly, there's still, the jury's still out on how particularly or geared towards sustainability a lot of the announcements are, because essentially they act as a repository, just in the same way a lot of people still believe that an Excel spreadsheet can do as good a job as some of these platforms. So they're a very good way of bringing the data together and doing a lot of things with the data, whether running AI, analytics, a lot of connecting technologies over it. But if you can't either get the data or you can't get good data, then it fundamentally breaks down. The opportunity is that a lot of these firms, it's not just the SAPs and the Oracles, but it's also the Microsofts, the Googles, the Amazon, or AWS, which is their cloud computing branch, is that they already have these ecosystems and they are plugged in to every single part of this, and they have a wealth of data that includes a lot of stuff on sustainability. And firms are crying out for these firms to leverage that and actually bring them the data. And that's not to say, that's not bringing, use two oil and gas firms as an example, that's not giving ExxonMobil BP's data. That is just giving their customers a good sense of what their impact across, might be emissions, labor practices, might be. On the phone just this afternoon, and I didn't realize this was happening in the oil and gas industry until today, is that they are starting to collaborate, and they have a central platform for monitoring labor practices throughout their supply chains, which when they go to a supplier and ask them to disclose what their labor practices are and variety of other metrics across sustainability, those suppliers will then put that information into a central platform that any oil and gas company can access. No one knows who initiated that request, so no one will know, for example, that BP decided to go with supplier X, and that's why supplier X put their information in this platform. It's completely anonymized from that point. But one facilitates having that data, but also standardizing that data across the industry and across the ecosystem so that everyone benefits, so that the data becomes more standardized and just generally more usable. So that's the final call to action that said come out to how many people from any of these platform or tech companies might be either here or watching online. But I'll try and get them at some point. But there's a broader theme that overhangs all of this, and I think this will hopefully bring me neatly to the end of my 10 to 15 minutes, is a variety of legal requirements. And there's a massive section in The Economist recently on global trade and how global supply chains were changing. And I am, by no means the person, and I think there'll be other people on the panel who are much more qualified to talk about environmental laws and labor laws within specific trade deals or within the policies and the laws of specific countries. But there seems to be a general consensus. Well, it's not just that there's a dire lack of transparency and traceability, visibility, quality of data, all of these things on the company side, but there aren't strict enough and very, very varying levels of legal requirements for companies and indeed governments to do anything about this. And I think that's me done. And I intended a lot of this to be, well, I think like everyone did, a bit of a setup for the discussion later. So maybe someone will answer the last point. I'm not too sure, but yeah, I'm very curious to either have a broader discussion about that point or either here today or away from it. But yeah, I will pass on. And look forward to that discussion.
Thank you so much. It wasn't quite clear to me whether you thought that the legal requirements were a problem or not. Is that the question you're raising?
Well, yeah, it's without wanting to totally abdicate myself of any responsibility in answering a question, the conclusion of people I trust to know much more about it than I do is that there aren't. That as our, I don't know what you want to call it, whether you want to just call it laws in general or specific trade deals need to have, sounds like stating the obvious, but need to have the right environmental protections and the right labor protections and the right protections across ES and G. But yeah, the broader conclusion seems to be that it's not enough right now.
It's not enough. Okay, right. Sometimes you hear the opposite. Well, I think you are among just exactly the right people today for having that question answered. And Natasha, you are our next speaker, tackling deforestation through community law rights. Please.
Thank you, Helle. And thanks to the two other speakers we had so far. And I think after hearing from Elizabeth about just transition and hearing from Josh about just and green supply chain, it is indeed quite fitting to talk about community land rights, which is one area where the protection of human rights goes hand in hand with environmental protection and efforts to halt deforestation. But what exactly are community land rights? Community land is such land that is held, used, or managed collectively by indigenous peoples or by local communities. And that's irrespective of whether the land is formally recognized as indigenous or community land or not. Community land covers, interestingly, more than 50% of the world's land surface area, and across all continents except Antarctica, and with the greatest proportion in Africa. One should say, though, that the proportion or the exact amount of community land is constantly changing, because in some countries, community land may be privatized, whereas in other countries, the land that is held by the state might be turned into community land. So we have a constantly changing amount of community land worldwide, but it's usually more than 50%. Community land rights, then, are the rights of the community to either own or use these lands. And they can be either customary in nature or they can be formally and legally recognized. 1/5 of existing community land, which is about 10% of the world's surface area, is legally owned by indigenous peoples and local communities, and about the same amount is formally recognized to constitute community land by governments. The majority of community land, however, lacks formal recognition. So we have communities that hold certain land, but it's not formally recognized by governments, so it's just a matter of customary tenure, basically. What are the problems with this lack of formal recognition? Well, historically, it was actually not a big problem because customary tenure and traditional institutions gave enough tenure security to the local communities. But now, with rising global demand for timber and non-timber products, and with growing desire to have economic advancements, this is unfortunately no longer the case. And all too often, land grabs by foreign investors or even by the local elites occur irrespective of existing customary rights, which are simply ignored by the governments and the corporations in question. This has devastating consequences for the communities and for local populations who are basically stripped of their livelihoods when they lose their lands. Because currently 2.5 billion people depend on community lands for their subsistence. And if you think about the world population being 7.9 billion currently, then that's 31% of all humans worldwide depending on community lands for their livelihoods. Land and its natural resources constitute important assets for rural communities and indigenous peoples. Community land provides vital resources such as food and water, medicinal plants, and fuel wood. For many communities, their land also carries great cultural and historical and occasionally also religious and spiritual significance. Even where resettlement and compensation schemes are instituted by the government in the country where the lands of the local communities are being privatized, resettlements, which are almost always involuntary, push many villagers into deep poverty. Legal recognition of community lands makes it less vulnerable, makes the land less vulnerable to land grabs, and offers more security to indigenous peoples and local communities. Giving a comprehensive picture of all of these benefits, and there are enormous benefits on the development side and on the environmental side of legally recognizing community land rights, but giving a comprehensive picture thereof would unfortunately exceed the scope of my brief talk here. So I would instead like to focus on the benefits of securing land tenure of communities in the particular context of forests and community forestry. Community land rights enable a concept called community forestry, which is a sustainable forest management regime. There's a wide variety of different community forestry regimes worldwide, so they come in different shapes, basically. Some differences relate to the legal nature of the land rights, for example, whether the land is owned by the community or whether the community just has usage rights over the land. Other differences relate to the procedural rules, such as whether, for example, such as which legal entity a community needs to form in order to obtain such land rights. Let me give you some examples which are based on research by the NGO Client Earth. In the Philippines, community-based forestry management was institutionalized as a national strategy in 1995. And communities need to form an entity called a people's organization in order to be allocated a particular plot of land, which they will then be allowed to occupy and develop. They also obtain rights to exclusive use of the forest resources. However, they do not get ownership of the land. It remains state-owned. Similarly, in Nepal, community forests are state-owned. They will be handed over to a community group registered as a legal entity for the development, conservation, and collective use. While there's no time limit to this tenure, there will be regular reviews of the management plans, so the community will have to make management plans, and they will be periodically reviewed by the government, and that happens about every 8 to 10 years. So it's still quite a long period, but there are these periodic reviews. In Tanzania, that's an interesting example. In Tanzania, communities have to first form a village, and as a village, they will then be able to be allocated community land by the government. And yet in other countries, customary tenure is occasionally recognized by the government and then formalized as land ownership of the communities over such lands. Community forestry regimes have expanded greatly in the last decades as the benefits of such regimes have become increasingly recognized. Not only does community forestry help to secure and improve livelihoods of local communities, but it also has very important ecological benefits, and most prominently the protection of forests and the prevention of deforestation. This is particularly so when communities have secure tenure over the forest land that they manage. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, has recognized that formalized community land rights and secure tenure are critical for effective community-based forestry, as they create incentives for the local communities to invest in the land that they hold. Secure tenure and secure and long-term rights over the land give communities more certainty that they will be actually able to enjoy the fruits of their labor. And this fosters sustainability, whereas the more insecure and short-term rights can lead to communities over-exploiting the land that they are allocated in an effort to maximize short-term benefits. According to research by the World Resources Institute and the Inter-American Development Bank, the average annual deforestation rates in 10-year secured indigenous forest lands in Bolivia, Brazil, and Colombia from 2000 to 2012 were 2 to 3 times lower than in similar land not managed by indigenous peoples. And titling of indigenous lands in the Peruvian Amazon in 2002 reduced forest clearing by more than 3/4 in the 2 subsequent years, so that's quite a substantial improvement there. Community forestry can therefore prevent large-scale deforestation. It can also help to prevent illegal logging, particularly when community forestry is embedded in an enabling legal framework with formal community forestry rules. According to, again, Client Earth research, some of the countries give communities authority not only to monitor their forests, but also to enforce rules vis-à-vis third parties. In the Philippines, for example, those aforementioned people's organizations, so the legal entity formed by the community to manage the forest, they are responsible for the protection and conservation of natural resources within their allocated area. And this includes the authority to apprehend illegal loggers and to confiscate illegally cut timber and tools used for cutting. This is actually quite interesting because actions like that are normally reserved for law enforcement officers, such as the police, for example. So it's quite interesting that communities are basically given state power to protect their lands. Another example is in Nepal. They actually built towers in order to monitor encroachment into community forests. And in Tanzania, members of committees formed by villages to govern those community forests, they undertake regular patrolling and they can apprehend any person engaged in illegal activities on the community territory. By their potential in preventing deforestation, both legal and illegal deforestation under national law, community forestry and community land rights contribute greatly to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly to the Sustainable Development Goal number 15, Life on Land. SDG 15, for those who are not familiar with it, formulates the aim to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. Furthermore, given the important role that forests play in climate mitigation by storing and sequestering carbon, community forestry also supports progress on Sustainable Development Goal number 13, climate action, which demands to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. A study published by the Rights and Resources Initiative in 2018 analyzed 52 tropical and subtropical countries with respect to carbon storage documented in community lands. And the findings show that 22% of the forest carbon found in these countries is actually stewarded by communities on those community lands. And these communities then make sure that the forest is sustainably managed and they prevent deforestation that would otherwise release those vast amounts of carbon stored in community forests. However, unfortunately, 1/3 of this carbon in those particular lands, in those particular countries that were analyzed, is located in areas where the community land tenure rights are not formally recognized. And that, of course, constitutes a risk of land grabs and deforestation, and then hence of the release of the carbon that is actually stored in those forests that are informally managed by communities. So if formal recognition of community land rights is so important, then how can it be achieved and what are the challenges in this endeavor? Firstly, it's important to notice that while some countries have national legislation in place that recognizes the concept of community tenure, and they also have formal processes in place for communities to seek those land rights, other countries' legislation unfortunately does not yet recognize any such concept of community-held land, and they do not have procedures in place for communities to formalize their land tenure. Formal legal recognition in those countries would therefore necessitate a law reform process, which is, of course, an inherently political process. The nature of this endeavor, granting legal land rights to communities, also involves the devolution of power to manage valuable resources in the respective countries that could potentially create faster income if they were just sold to big corporations. For elected office holders, the latter option can provide faster rewards, which is particularly attractive when elections are nearing, and particularly in developing countries. Any attempts by NGOs to facilitate law reform processes or to kick off law reform processes therefore needs to be carefully timed, and it needs to follow a comprehensive policy analysis of the country where the NGO is trying to initiate a law reform process. Secondly, even when the concept of community rights is legally recognized in a particular country, there are still big challenges for communities to actually get their land formally recognized. And that's related to, or that is so because the relevant procedures are often complex and complicated and very lengthy, and they can pose particular challenges for communities that have high illiteracy rates. The World Resources Institute found that the relevant procedure in the Philippines, for example, requires, anyone wants to have a guess how many steps are legally mandated in this procedure? No? 56. So in the Philippines, for a community to have their lands legally recognized, they have to go to 56 legally mandated steps, which is quite a lot. In Indonesia, 21 government agencies are involved, agencies or departments are involved in the process of granting community land rights. And in Uganda, quite interesting, some steps in the process, they do have a formal process and a legally recognized process, but some steps in this process require going via agencies that do not even yet exist in particular departments. So in fact, there is a procedure, but communities can't follow it because the relevant government agencies don't exist. There's also, unfortunately, quite a stark contrast between the procedures to recognize community land on the one hand and the procedures for companies to acquire land on the other hand. Regulatory and policy frameworks seem to often favor investors over communities, with governments offering specific government support schemes to companies, while communities have to largely rely on NGOs for financial and administrative support. There are a number of things that NGOs such as Client Earth, the World Resources Institute, and Land Rights Now, to name just a few of them, there are many NGOs working on community land rights at the moment. So there are a number of things that they are actively working on to support greater recognition of community land rights in the respective countries. And I would like to stress only one important aspect of this work, which I already briefly mentioned, and those are iterative and participatory law reform processes in those countries. They are participatory and have to be participatory in the sense that a multitude of different stakeholders will be involved. Those include government officials, representatives from the industry, civil society, and also importantly local communities and indigenous peoples who will be consulted in their respective constituencies or locally by the NGOs, because often as you can imagine, it's also quite difficult for indigenous communities to travel to a workshop on community land rights that might be held in the capital. So NGOs try to facilitate these participatory processes by going to the communities in the respective country and locally. Iterative refers to regular reviews of the law reforms and to new reforms as opposed to just a one-off reform. And that allows for regular improvements based on how the new laws work in practice. And importantly, these reform endeavors should always emphasize the importance of clear and accessible procedures for communities to formalize their land rights. Of course, there's no magic solution to all of this, and different national circumstances require very different kinds of action. But since I'm talking to a research community today, I would like to encourage researchers of various different disciplines to consider devoting some time looking into this quite fascinating and very important topic of community land rights. And just to give an example, I think a lot of research could, for example, be done in comparative law, because all of the countries have very different processes, and it would be quite interesting to analyze those different processes. And from there, maybe anthropologists, social and political scientists could take over and look at the underlying causes. Why are those laws so different in the different countries? And why are there such different processes? And how do they relate to cultural and social and societal causes, basically? And yeah, these are just some ideas, and I hope we get to discuss some of these aspects a little bit more in the roundtable. And also, if you want to reach out to me after that, I'm always very happy to discuss community land rights. Thanks.
Thank you so much to the three of you. You managed just on time, which I think is fantastic, as a good start. And I also think that you got us off to a very good start in terms of answering the first of the 4 questions that we were asked to address throughout this week. How can we make sustainability fair and equitable for all is the first question. And the second one is, what is the role of corporate versus government versus personal responsibility? So thank you so much for that. We have now a little more than 10 minutes or so for interaction, Q&A with the audience. So would anybody like to open the discussion? Yes, please.
Amazing talk. It was really cool. I was wondering, I've done some work on land rights as well, and there's a group in Peru, an indigenous group called UNIMAP, who are asking for constitutional recognition of land rights. And I just wanted to know what you thought about that approach to land right acquisition.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. That's a very good question, actually. So, of course, for everyone who's not a lawyer, I think for the lawyers that's quite obvious, but in every country there's like different sources of law, and the constitution is usually the highest source of law of any particular country, unless the country specifically puts international law on top of constitutional law. But usually constitutional law is the highest source of law. And I think recognizing the concept of community land rights in the Constitution is is a step that is very symbolic. I'm not entirely convinced that a symbolic step will actually translate into feasible laws, like on a lower level, into feasible laws that can actually be implemented in practice. But it's certainly a big step for a country to recognize community lands and to put them into the Constitution, which is then at least there's an incentive for them, once they have them symbolically recognized, to also follow through with it in practice and to put actual, actionable laws into practice. So, yeah, I think it's a very good initiative, and I would definitely support it. But I would like to stress that it's not enough. It's great to have them in the Constitution, but there need to be laws that can actually be implemented in practice for it to really make a noticeable difference for the communities and for the environment. But it's a good question, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Don't be timid. Yes, please.
Thank you. Elizabeth, what you presented was so compelling about the consequences of things that we're being asked to do. Do you have any? You told us all the problems. There wasn't much in solution. As a consumer, think, well, I ought to go and get that electric car, and stop worrying about how far could I travel. But at least I've got an electric car. And you're saying to me, you're buying that electric car. You're harming children who are mining, and you're damaging other things. So, where do we go from pointing out that there's problems to reaching to those just solutions? It was staggering, the problems that you're facing me as a consumer with, but you didn't give me as a consumer any idea about where I go next.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I do think that the consumer isn't powerless. We're not powerless right now, and there are a number of things that we can do. For example, we can put pressure on large companies. You can either have an organisation representing human rights, for example, labour rights, community rights, land rights, going along to the board meeting of a large company. That's quite a good way of raising attention. I have been in large AGMs where well-organised NGOs have been able to put pressure on the board to account for the way that they manage human rights, so labour rights, land rights, community rights, security and human rights. And that can be quite powerful. Another thing that we can do, and when I say we, it is easier if organisations, so NGOs, for example, do this, is to try and influence the financial world, the investor community.
I think I got it.
Because if you can get the investor community to pay more attention to climate change issues and allied human rights issues, that can be very influential on large companies. And actually, to some extent, that is already happening. There are a number of, large investors who pay a lot more attention to these topics. Sometimes it is for, if you like, simply because they may care about them, but I would also contend that they also sometimes do it because they themselves are under pressure from their stakeholders to demonstrate that when they lend money to large companies for big projects, that they are pressing those companies to do the right thing, both environmentally and in human rights terms. And nothing squeezes a company that needs to borrow money more than being told by their lenders that they've got to meet certain standards, either to get the money in the first place or to continue getting the cash stream for a long-term loan. They have to demonstrate that they are meeting certain standards. So those are a couple of things that that we can do. Much easier if we get together to do that. I freely admit, though, that it's pretty tricky as an individual, right? When you're out shopping for your cotton T-shirt, how do you know whether the T-shirt that you're buying is that the cotton is grown, that the T-shirt is made, perhaps in a factory in Bangladesh, for example? Does it have the right health and safety standards? Are people exploited? Are women paid as much as men? Are they paid a living wage? It's pretty hard for me to know that. But one thing I think I will stick my neck out and say is that if a T-shirt costs £2.50, personally, I am deeply sceptical whether that can possibly be made with excellent environmental and social standards behind it in the supply chain. So I'm not answering, all of your questions, but I've just given a couple of examples. And if you can put pressure on the large companies, I do think that helps a bit with the supply chain situation, because those large companies will then need to pass on some of those requirements to their own suppliers. Can I just say one other thing? Otherwise my answer will be longer than my talk. And that is, I think it's worth mentioning the role of public procurement. Governments around the world spend billions and billions of dollars on buying things and services. We should try to put pressure on our governments via our MPs, for example, or our representatives, whatever they're called in our own countries, to be active on this point, because the power of government procurement and therefore of the standards that they choose to set is very strong indeed. So that's just a few thoughts.
Could I add something very brief? very brief on that. I mean, you mentioned how difficult it is as a consumer to figure out what the impact of what you buy is. Many of the biggest companies in the world don't know what their own impact is, especially when it goes right down through the supply chain. It could be 10 plus tiers, 10 times removed. There are some very, very impressive companies. Are they two very quick examples? I mean, Microsoft can trace the metals that they use in their technology data centers, for example, down to the mine and the specific day that it was mined. You've obviously got the whole thing about garbage in, garbage out, and how do you then make sure that what's being entered and what they're saying they're doing is what they are doing, but that's a separate story. Walmart can trace a batch of dodgy lettuce in 2 seconds. Used to take them 6 days, and they built a solution underpinned by blockchain technology with IBM. They can do it in 2 seconds now, as soon as they know this batch is contaminated, for example. And it kind of circles around to a sort of question I was thinking, Natasha, as you were speaking about, so what the government appetite might be for the wider impacts of, like, all the way down the supply chains, and thinking, is the solution, because I think as a consumer, there are some things that you buy and there are some companies where you could probably go online and find information all the way down the supply chain. Some are starting to incorporate QR and barcodes on their products that you can actually find out is the exact person who farmed this coffee bean, and you can actually tip them. I'm not. It's a big project by Accenture. I'd have to relook into what consumer goods products are firms are using it, but that kind of thing is being developed. But I suppose the question on for that, and it might be something for the discussion later, is the solution from a government standpoint to mandate companies to disclose their impact and figure out how to map what their impact is, or is it to it's probably a case of both, or is it to legally mandate these standards in trade deals, for example? And I suppose the government procurement angle comes into that massively. Again, we'll need someone with a lot more expertise in policy and law to figure that one out.
But I think we have to leave that for the discussion later on. But it does touch upon all those issues of ownership, Natasha, that you were talking about, and the whole business models of these. So money is entering the picture in big time too. Now, thank you so much to our panel for now, because I'm going to leave the moderating to Jelena. Where are you? You're coming here. So should we just give everybody a hand and thank them for their talks?
Should you sit here and I just sit here? So thank you, Helle, and thank you everyone here today for joining all of us. My name is Jelena. I'm a Global Pact for the Environment ambassador and also a law student here at Hughes Hall. It is, again, such a pleasure to have all of you here and continue a discussion that has been turning more and more legal, perhaps. We also have our panelists here, but I think Charlie is going to make sure everyone can see them. I will start maybe perhaps with a little bit of background. So in 1972, the Stockholm Conference recognized that there are global environmental issues. And since then, there have been other important international legal agreements proposed and adopted, sort of forming this patchwork of international treaties. However, there has never been this one unified, comprehensive treaty on international environment that will recognize environmental rights and duties for all. And in the past few years in particular, the academics, public figures, the civil society and individuals have been all kind of uniting all around the world. They have launched initiatives such as One Planet, One Right, which seeks to make sure that the right to a healthy environment is a human right, and formed the Global Pact Coalition, which seeks to adopt a unified and comprehensive global pact for the environment. So in today's panel, we will hear a little bit about the brief history of the international environmental law and the key gaps that we have here. The panel will also explain what is the Global Pact for the Environment and the coalition which is fighting to adopt the pact.
address some of the biggest recent developments in the field and finish with how would adopting the pact contribute to the fight against climate change. This is why I'm very honored to present the panel today. So we have, joining us online is Professor Jorge Vinuales, Harold Samuel Chair of Law and Environmental Policy at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Noel Kumpel, Head of Policy at BirdLife International, Alyssa Dami with us here today, a lawyer and a PhD student in international environmental law here at Wolfson, Cambridge. And joining us online as well, Lionel Shami, who is the Special Advisor at the Global Pact for the Environment. So let's start with Professor Vinuales. Could you walk us through the history and the main principles of international environmental law, the gaps that we have here, and how does the Global Pact for the Environment fit in here?
Yes, thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure and honor to be addressing this audience. Hopefully you can hear me well. The project that the Global Pact Coalition has espoused, I think, makes a lot of sense today, but it has been really a project that has been long in the making, if one considers all the initiatives that have been taken in the past to get to this point. I could explain the origins and then the actual project, but the problem sometimes of doing these things in that order is that the interest of the origins gets sort of sided in a way that makes them less prominent, and I think it's very important to make them very clear. So I will start with the text of the project itself, and then I will introduce it very briefly because I know that it's going to be fleshed out later. But then I will place that in the longer history of the initiatives to come up with a sort of constitution of international environmental law. So the project itself. So the idea of this project that we developed together with a number of colleagues, and Jan Aguila has been particularly present in that project, is really to draft, or was to draft, what could be called a pre-project. So it's not really a draft, it's an avant-projet. It's something much more formal, more formalized than a draft. Although we are, of course, completely aware that if a negotiation process was indeed launched, it would be really rewritten. But we wanted to start, or use as a starting basis, something that would be a bit more thought through, a bit more formulated, and this is why we came up with this. I mean, all the experts in the committee, we came up with this pre-project that was presented to the French presidency, to President Emmanuel Macron, as well as to other big figures in the field, including Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General, and others. So this pre-project has a very clear purpose, which is to come up with a binding treaty, which would play the same role as an environmental statute in domestic context. Not a sexual statute, but the domestic environmental statute, a general statute, stating the principles and with some basic organizational issues. Now, the content itself really is a draft that, as it will be further developed later, is in 9 languages, including all the UN official languages. And it has 1 preamble and 26 articles. 20 of those articles are substantive and 6 are organizational. And the substantive articles, the 20 substantive articles, I think it's really their day. Their day has come. One is a right to the environment of a certain quality. We use 4 objectives. And as you know, a bit more than a week ago, such a right has been for the first time recognized in a resolution of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, although there is a lot of work and it is recognized, of course, at the domestic level. We were missing that step at the international level, and we hoped it's only a first step. But the treaty, I mean, the Global Pact would start with the right. That would be Article 1, and together with Article 1, there would be immediately a duty of care, and many people that have asked about the actual relevance in practice of a duty of care, should only look at climate litigation. Climate litigation has been widely based on quite unlikely legal tools, very unspecific legal tools, including the duty of care of the Dutch Civil Code, which is extremely important and has been extremely important, not just in the Urgenda case, but more recently in this landmark case, at least at the first instance, which is the Milieu Defensie case against Royal Dutch Shell. Now, that right and duty would be followed by 18 principles, where you find a little bit the usual principles of international environmental law, including prevention, environmental impact assessment, and cooperation, but also precaution, intergenerational equity, and others. There is some novelty as well that has been added in the text, including the principle of resilience, and some principles that are becoming more and more recognized, such as the principle of non-regression. Now, I will not go too much into a detail, because what I want to show you now is how this piece of potential law, how this actual project or pre-project fits in the longer history of the initiatives to come up with a constitution for the environment at the international level. On the process, I guess that the idea of stating principles is at least as old as the Stockholm Conference that was mentioned at the beginning. At Stockholm, there was already this idea to identify a set of principles. Principle 21, which came to be called the Stockholm Principle, is today the prevention principle and is a cornerstone of the entire field of international environmental law. But over time, that idea became more and more specific, and after the end of the Brundtland Commission between 1983 and 1987, an actual recommendation was made to develop a draft convention on the environment. At the time, the IUCN really took that recommendation to heart and developed a draft that has been over time adapted and adjusted and updated, and there are many versions of the draft. And the draft has been very useful for the Global Pact Initiative to think about the issue and how to frame it. But perhaps because the recurrent appearance in different fora of this idea of a global pact, which is quite similar in that respect to the recurrent popping up of the idea of a global environment organization or a global environmental court, which actually tends to be an idea that one nods to kindly but doesn't actually take forward any longer. That project had in a way been confined to that uncomfortable but kind and gentle place, which is, we all know that there is this initiative, but no one really pays any serious attention until really there was this initiative from the Club des Juristes in 2015 that led to the Committee of Experts in 2017, and then of course to the espousal or the endorsement by a number of major figures, including the former COP21 president Laurent Fabius, and of course the French president Emmanuel Macron. And this was taken to the General Assembly, and for a while we actually believed that it would actually go further. Unfortunately, that process that was launched was altered or reduced or limited by just a handful of nations that were skeptical about having these principles stated in hard law, in a binding treaty. But the initiative was not entirely altered, because in that respect, the process leading to the Stockholm Plus 50 conference that will take place next year has left some room open for progress, for a declaration. It will not be, at least it's not envisioned to come up with the idea of a binding treaty, but there will be a declaration, and that declaration could actually do or make some progress in the same way as the other two ideas. I mean, the two ideas that one gently nods at, the international or the Global Environmental Organization and the Global Environmental Court. Those two ideas have also been gently gaining ground. Just to give you an idea of what has happened with the Global Environmental Organization, right after the conference in Rio Plus 20 in 2012, the idea of enlarging, expanding the UNEP Governing Council to all members of the General Assembly and coming up with this structure that we now call the UN Environment Assembly was launched and actually was accepted. And okay, it's not a global environmental organization, but it's a very powerful idea that has been at the forefront of a number of initiatives, including, for example, the possibility of a treaty on plastic. And the other idea, the court, an environmental court, well, it is true that there has been no environmental court, but all courts have become environmental. These days, environmental litigation, at least since the early 1990s, there has been an upward trend, and these last years, I think that environmental litigation, particularly in connection with climate change, has skyrocketed. And it relies very much on international law. So in the absence of that World Environment Court, what has come to happen is really that many courts have become environmental courts, even without the name. So we're hoping that even if the parameters for what may happen in Stockholm next year are limited, we're really hoping that the progress that we have seen in the other two pillars could be seen, and that we can actually do a Rio Plus declaration, that would capture the very significant developments that have taken place since 1992. Thank you very much. Those are just a few ideas, and I would be happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Viñuales. As you have said, there have been really great developments, especially, even this very month. I would like to now move to Dr. Kampel, who, together with BirdLife Partnership, launched and led the One Planet, One Right campaign, which very recently led to a successful resolution to recognize a healthy environment as a human right at the UN. Before we hear a little bit more about that, I think we have a short video.
Great, thanks. Shall I make a start?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me okay? Brilliant, great. Hi, thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to join this event today. It's such a critical time for nature, climate and people, so it's brilliantly timed. I have to say I'm really busy right now, sandwiched between COP15 from the Convention on Biological Diversity last week and just preparing for the COP26 very, very soon. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about BirdLife's One Planet, One Right campaign that you just saw the video for there, and the wider call from governments, business and civil society for the universal human right to a healthy environment, and why the recognition and critically the implementation of this right could be truly transformative in achieving our goal of an equitable, carbon neutral, nature positive future. So delivering on the human rights, climate and biodiversity agendas together. So the current devastating pandemic provides a stark warning that healthy economies and healthy societies rely on a healthy planet. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and the life-sustaining climate we enjoy all are dependent on healthy, functioning, biodiverse ecosystems and are essential for human life and dignity. The global environmental emergency therefore currently violates and jeopardizes the human rights of billions of people on our planet, not to mention billions more to come as the situation worsens. BirdLife International is the world's largest nature conservation partnership. We're a family of over 115 autonomous organisations working with local stakeholders for nature and people around the world. Almost every BirdLife partner has examples of where climate change and biodiversity loss is impacting human rights, and we therefore believe that we have both a moral duty and that there's a clear economic case to reset our relationship with nature through strengthening policy frameworks and a just green pandemic recovery. While 80% of states now recognise the right to a healthy environment in national and regional constitutions and legal frameworks, the current global health and climate and emergency now needs to be recognised and implemented everywhere for all people and all sectors. There's considerable support for this, backed by a wealth of evidence and consultations from the UN Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights and the Environment, John Knox, and since 2018, David Boyd. Given this, the BirdLife Partnership launched our One Planet, One Right campaign on Earth Day last year. This timing was particularly pertinent, being the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and coming just after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Initially supported by the 115-strong BirdLife Partnership, as well as by organisations such as Client Earth and the Global Pax Coalition, businesses such as Patagonia and legal experts such as the Special Rapporteur David Boyd and renowned international justice barrister Philippe Sands, the campaign is calling on the UN through the Human Rights Council and General Assembly to pass resolutions recognising the right to a healthy environment.
Spotlighted. Perhaps I am already spotlit.
So I've got a bit of
so let me just
something going on in the background.
To my
I'll just carry on.
view, and then I'll be able to see. Voila. So good
Okay,
afternoon.
and for this to be
our
incorporated
virtual
into the upcoming
audience and to
post-2020
our
Global
delightful
Biodiversity
speakers.
Framework,
A very,
climate
very warm
action
welcome
under the
to this online
UNFCCC,
event.
and
Here
across
you
the work of the UN through bodies such as its Environment Management Group. As part of our wider One Planet, One Right campaign, BirdLife then joined forces with over 1,350 civil society organisations, Indigenous peoples, social movements and local communities in a global call for the UN Human Rights Council to recognise without delay the human right of all to a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment. This letter originally went to the 45th meeting of the Human Rights Council in September last year, where Costa Rica led a joint call with the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia and Switzerland, which are known as the core group of states for this resolution, for this right to be recognised. Less than 2 weeks ago, the 47 members of the Council at its 48th session voted resoundingly in support of this resolution, recognising the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And this got no votes against and just 4 abstentions, was a fantastic result. This augurs well for a smooth passage now to the UN General Assembly, and if a similar resolution is passed there, this would then become a universal right. We're currently working to get as many co-sponsors of the resolution in place as possible, which would really help to strengthen that support. The deadline's tomorrow, if any of you are well connected to UN member states and want to help with that push. In parallel, we need the right to be better integrated across the UN, as I mentioned, and into wider environmental treaties and national implementation, such as on action and commitments to the UN Climate Convention's Paris Agreement, and critically the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is currently under negotiation. We've been advocating to embed the right into the principles, goals, milestones, targets, and/or enabling conditions of the new biodiversity framework, and now have a much clearer justification for this in the upcoming negotiations, which are going to culminate at COP15 in Kunming, China, in April, May next year, when the new framework will be signed. So all this will provide a much clearer, universally applicable foundation for states and other actors, including business, to bring clarity to the obligations and interdependencies relating to environmental and human rights law. And then on the ground, the formal recognition of the customary rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities under national law, protections for environmental and human rights defenders, and the enshrinement of fair and equitable access and benefit sharing are all concrete steps to recognising this right to a healthy environment. And BirdLife partners are working around the world to support these rights on the ground. I'll give you a few examples here now. So firstly, we're a founder member of the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights, and our partners are working with local people around the world to improve outcomes for nature and people through a rights-based approach to constitutional provisions, legislation, regulations, policies, programmes, or other measures. Examples of such work on the ground by our partners include developing protected and conserved areas with Indigenous peoples in the Canadian boreal forests, supporting community associations to manage forests in Madagascar, reviving the traditional HEMA conservation areas approach in Lebanon, and strengthening implementation of the principle of free, prior, informed consent and the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act for Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. So our partnership-wide One Planet, One Right campaign epitomises our local to global approach, together we're the power of many. And finally, just to end on how all of this is relevant to climate action and what we need to see from COP26, as that's what we're discussing this week. So protecting, managing, restoring and financing nature is crucial to addressing the climate, biodiversity, poverty and health crises in an integrated and mutually supportive manner. And so it's central to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Importantly, this must be done through a rights-based approach and in parallel to, but not instead of, an urgent fossil fuel phase-outs and economy-wide emissions reductions. Having at the previous COP25 underlined the essential contribution of nature to addressing climate change and its impacts and the need to address biodiversity loss and climate change in an integrated manner, parties now need to operationalise this provision, as well as other vital ecosystem provisions under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and anchor nature in the formal text outcomes that will be adopted at COP26. And our key messages here are that reversing nature loss by 2030, whilst also at the same time halving emissions this decade, and including those from land-based emissions, is crucial to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and build a more resilient world. And nature-based solutions are ready to be deployed in every country, with Indigenous peoples and local communities at the heart of this action. And that finally, nature-based solutions are the smartest investments to avoid emissions from nature loss, draw down carbon from the atmosphere, and help us reach net zero, whilst providing climate resilience and adaptation. So I hope all that demonstrates how we need to work in a more joined up way and use global policy processes to support concrete action on the ground by local stakeholders to achieve the equitable, carbon neutral, nature positive future our children deserve and need. Thank you.
Thank you, Noelle. Partnership and alliance seem to be quite an important force in trying to achieve some of these very ambitious environmental goals. So, Lionel, moving over to you, could you tell us a little bit about the Global Pact Coalition and how and why it seeks to ensure a right to a healthy environment?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Yelena. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Noelle. It's great to be talking to all of you and everyone at Cambridge today. So I'd first like to give more of an activist perspective on what it means to have a right to a healthy environment recognized, to complement Jorge's academic and historical approach and Noelle's advocacy and international organization approach. Because we often get the question of what does it mean for people on the ground to get a right to a healthy environment recognized in international convention. And to do so, I'd like to start by doing something a bit unusual and begin with a personal story of mine, as I have this feeling that we tend to forget about the human element when we talking, the high spheres of international law and policy. So when I was no older than 10, I used to live in the countryside in Lebanon. And every Sunday during spring, we used to venture out in the meadows and harvest strands of mountain thyme. We eat this a lot. And I do distinctly remembering the sounds and the smells of spring in this countryside as some of my fondest childhood memories. So a few years back, when I went back to Lebanon, I returned to that happy place of mine and I found it changed utterly. A highway had been built atop of it, and the beautiful meadow that I knew was now littered with trash cans, plastic bags, bottles, and not much remained of the place that I once knew. And so I decided to do something about it. I went there every Sunday with 2 trash bags, trying to clean as much as I could of the place. And I repeated the same gesture week after week until I realized that to some extent, this was futile. I couldn't clean all of the place up on my own, nor would it help if there were many people doing this. Why? Because cleanups and what I was trying to do was reactive. But to be long-lasting, we need to act preventively. It's way cheaper too. So if you want to be preventive, if you want your actions to be long-lasting, then you have to use the power of the law. And this is what we're trying to do at the Global Pact Coalition. We're trying very hard to have states adopt an international convention that would recognize people's fundamental right to a healthy environment, and to recognize that states and businesses and individuals everywhere have a duty to take care of the environment, a legal duty. So let me give you 3 reasons why we need such a global pact. We need it because we need to change the law, because law is what regulates societies. It governs and can change the behavior of citizens, states, and corporations, and it must be improved to create environmental rights and duties for all. Secondly, we have to act on the international level. It's the only level that counts if we really want to protect the planet. The ecological crisis doesn't stop at country borders. In light of that, when you look at international environmental law, you see that it's clearly insufficient. It's made up of sectoral and highly technical conventions, which deal with problems one by one. While we know that ecological phenomena are transborder, that they're interdependent, and we know that global warming has disastrous effects on biodiversity. But when you look at it from the perspective of international environmental law, these problems are dealt with one by one, as if there were no links between the two. So a global pact would be an umbrella text that ensures a coherent and comprehensive approach to environmental protection. Now, when we say this, we often fall upon the argument that people say, which is that international environmental law is never really implemented. It's this theoretical thing that exists on the international level. People talk about it at the UN, but there's no real impact on the ground. And I'd like to disprove that theory. And this is my third argument, that we need environmental rights because they allow to tackle the Achilles heel of environmental law, which is lack of implementation. There's an equation that UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd, says a lot. He says that environmental law plus human rights equals accountability. And we've seen this equation being demonstrated in courtrooms worldwide. The Urgenda judgment in the Netherlands proved that governments can be sued and constrained by court orders. So it works. And this is happening not only in one country, it's happening around the world, from France to Chile to Indonesia, Pakistan, etc. And a global pact would ensure the recognition of the environmental rights of all. It stands in the lineage of these great foundational texts of humankind, such as the Magna Carta or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in the same way that we've seen the 19th century recognize the civil and political rights of people, such as the freedom of expression, the freedom of association, the right to vote, etc., the 20th century enshrined economic and social rights, such as the right to healthcare or the right to strike. In the 21st century, our main preoccupation is the environment. It is climate change. It's an existential threat to humankind. And this is why we need a third generation of fundamental rights for the 21st century. These rights are environmental rights. They include the right to a healthy environment, the right to access environmental information, the right of people to participate in decision-making that pertains to the environment, and the right to access environmental justice to seek redress. So to sum it up, we need 3 things. We need law, we need to act at the international level, and we need environmental rights. And this is what the Global Pact Coalition has set out to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel, for a wonderful presentation about why we need such rights and what can we do to actually achieve them. Moving to Alice. You have done some research on environmental justice as well as how international environmental law sort of helps us fight climate change. Could you tell us more about how Global Pact for the Environment could precisely help us fight climate change?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I will build on what Lionel has so eloquently put to us, and I'll try to avoid overlap, but I'll also try to keep in mind the questions that Wolfson COP26 week specifically pinned down, which I think are very relevant to the Global Pact approach, and has actually spurred this idea to bring in the team to present the project. So we're a couple of weeks away from COP26 and the next round of big negotiations at the UN. And how does this fit with the projects that we've been presented today? Well, Laurent Fabius, who was obviously very involved in the Paris Agreement and has been described as the father, introduced the idea of the pact itself as the natural, logical next step to the Paris Agreement. So the pact itself expands and builds, complements, but support in a foundational way the efforts, the international community's efforts to tackle the climate crisis. And what I'd say is that climate change is an issue that challenges the understanding of how we relate to nature, but also of how we relate to each other as humans. And this calls on us to really look at the values that we choose to define those relationships. And for that, we need to also adopt a coherent value system. This, through the law, is a very, very compelling argument for a project like the Pact, because the Pact would provide the international agreement that we need to lean on to express those values and promote adherence to them in a way that really tackles our challenges, which are justice and the delivery of justice and inequality. So the Pact specifically includes values of justice, of respect and care for the entirety of the Earth system beyond the sectorial approach that maybe the climate change legal landscape focuses on, and ensures that we also tackle the challenges that societal interests across different communities present. It would act as a bedrock, therefore, for our society to move ahead and tackle all the challenges that are linked to climate change. We know that we cannot act nor think in silos, so an integrated strategy for environmental protection beyond climate change action is essential. And so the Pact will promote, by providing a social contract for all members of society and all facets, a way to, will promote a contract that also promotes action beyond zero carbon, so that we reach, ideally, zero poverty, zero loss of biodiversity, and given the experience of the last 2 years, I think we'd be keen to see zero pandemics, of course, included in that approach. Also, from an institutional perspective, it builds on coherence across global environmental governance, so that the different components, institutional components, actually complement each other and mutually support each other, rather than create further obstacles through overlap and conflict, which often we see in the global framework for environmental protection. And then just looking at more specific examples or points about the content of the Pact and the contributions it can make to building on the Paris Agreement, I'll focus on 3 areas, which also will show that I think that it's one of the most effective ways to move forward the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda set by the UN to 2030. So in delivering climate justice and environmental justice more broadly, we know that we're all affected by climate change, of course, but different communities bear different brunts of the challenge and the effects. And often the more vulnerable communities and the ones that have the least means are the ones most affected. And they might be the ones that have least contributed to the actual climate crisis we face. So climate justice and environmental justice is a huge area of focus for all states. The Biden administration has made it an essential component of how it rolls out its climate change policies. And obviously we've just heard about the recent discussions and decisions at the Human Rights Council to recognize the fundamental right to a healthy environment. The pact obviously articulates that really well and clearly in ideally a binding way for all, which will include not just states and individuals but corporates as well. And also in its text it spells out and reinforces the approach of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities of states, which pays attention to the different levels of capacity and financial means for certain states and the least developed states and most vulnerable states to chip in and help on climate change action. The other area I think is that we've touched on is of contribution of the pact that we've touched on is this holistic approach to environmental protection. And this is important because, for example, in the context of climate change, we often risk and the perverse effect of environmental problem shifting. So the regime might promote and push states to adopt decarbonizing measures, but in doing that, the result could be an increased loss of biodiversity elsewhere or in a different sector. And at the same time, a holistic approach really optimizes the cross-cutting benefits that any environmental action can have. So, for example, if we're looking at halting deforestation, that will, or tackling ocean acidification, that will inherently have a positive effect on climate change by preserving carbon sinks. Or if we are approaching biodiversity loss by improving the sustainable use of land, that would also improve food security situations for more vulnerable communities who are dependent on agricultural resources. So it is important to step back and beyond climate change, and the pact really allows to do that and make those connections. And then finally, it really, ideally in its legal form, in legally binding format, would provide the solid basis that we need for legislators, governments, and courts to push and implement climate change measures that are ambitious and effective, and do so, for example, when interpreting the law through national courts with reference to principles of ecological integrity. And in climate change action, that's, in the context of the Paris Agreement, that's really important because where states have make national determined contributions, which they set for themselves, they become really effective when they're translated through domestic law. And the courts have a huge role to play, as witnessed by all the increase in environmental litigation. On top of that, we have some innovation in the text of the pact, introducing principles, I think Lionel and Jorge mentioned, that are quite groundbreaking. The one I would highlight is the principle of resilience that creates a duty to go beyond business as usual in taking environmental action. States cannot just wait for the risk to materialize and maybe remedy the environmental harm. They actually proactively have to address the imbalances in ecosystems and difficulties and challenges that affect the most vulnerable communities to improve the health of the ecosystem. So that's really groundbreaking, and also the pact reinforces the non-regression principle, which means that states cannot go back in time and lower the environmental standards that they've set. So we are actually moving forward. So in conclusion, I just say that the pact really does strengthen the foundations that we need to then build to face the environmental challenges that we have in a normatively coherent way that is just for all. And from there, ideally, everything else will follow. Thanks.
Thank you, Alice, in trying to explain how the pact tries to achieve this more holistic approach in the fight against climate change. Before we move on back to the audience, I just wanted to ask a few questions to all the speakers. Let's start with Noel, actually. You said that, rightfully you mentioned in your speech that around 150 countries already recognize the right to a healthy environment in their respective domestic laws. So why is this resolution that came just so recently from the UN Human Rights Council so significant? I think you are on mute.
Things like the Basel Convention on Chemicals and Waste, they all collectively commit to meet these global targets.
Noel, could you please start over because we did not hear you?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, sorry. So I won't go through the list again, but various multilateral environmental agreements, by signing up to those at global level, countries commit to meet those global targets and strategies through national action plans. But those treaties vary in the strength of their compliance frameworks. And so, for example, the CBD, its targets are non-binding. So as a result, there's limited accountability. And as we've seen from both the CBD's own Global Biodiversity Outlook most recent report, and in fact our own Birds and Biodiversity Targets reports, which track progress against the current Aichi targets, at national level, both ambition and implementation have tended to fall far short of what's needed to deliver these global targets. So that doesn't mean that countries can't make their national nature targets legally binding, and then by doing that, they can set long-term strategies and funding that isn't then at the whim of changes in government, and can provide a much clearer, more stable regulatory environment for business. But that's where applying a human rights lens can be really powerful, as it shifts the moral and legal obligation to comply with the agreed targets from environmental to human rights law. So where appropriate human rights frameworks are in place, this can bind countries and businesses to deliver on their environmental commitments, or what scientific advice says is necessary, for example, with the Paris Agreement, to ensure the enjoyment of human rights. So the first example of such legal action being taken was by the Agenda Foundation, which filed and won a lawsuit in 2013 against the Dutch government, directing it to slash its greenhouse gas emissions. The government appealed, but the Supreme Court upheld this decision in December 2019, and that has spurned over 1,000 other climate lawsuits around the world, in numerous countries. So that's an example of how having the universal right to a healthy environment then just ensures a clear legal framework for such actions for all people and all sectors in all countries. So ensuring that the remaining 20% of countries that don't have that in place have it covered through this universal right. And then, as I mentioned, the other flip side of that is then that we have a much stronger case to embed human rights provisions into the environmental frameworks themselves, as I mentioned, and that we're trying to get incorporated into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So then it sort of works on both sides in that sense. Thanks.
Thank you, Noel. Professor, over to you. You have also noted that it's been almost 50 years since the Stockholm Declaration, yet there still hasn't been a global pact for the environment. So my question to you, is it the lack of political will only, or perhaps it's also a legal or procedural issue?
It's a good question. The short answer is I don't know, because there have been different reasons over time for different setbacks. I think that fundamentally the old reason was a lack of trust, a perception of environmental policy as something that, from the perspective of developing countries, was seen essentially as a new trick by developed countries to keep their underdevelopment where it was, and in the best of cases, to look at environmental protection as a luxury item for countries that are already developed. Of course, you cannot blame them you cannot blame them. And the actual architecture, although there is a lot of discussion and has been a lot of discussion about the order of the SDGs. I mean, the first SDG is the fight against poverty. And actually, in order to get to a purely environmental SDG, you need to get to probably SDG number 12. You see, it's the three pillars of sustainable development are in many ways turning brownish, and even the tension at the time of Rio in 1992, when principles of environmental protection were supposed to be adopted, and many the delegates of some developed countries presented the Rio Declaration as an Earth Charter that would be in every child's room, and a developing country representative answer, well, not every child has a room. So that tension, which I for many years I have called the development-environment equation, has not been solved. And because it has not been solved, I think that this is what's lurking in the shadows each time that environmental protection as such, pure environmental protection, or very strong emphasis on environmental protection comes to the fore and tries to assert itself in the form of principles. If you look at the Global Pact for the Environment, I mean the draft, it is very strongly environmental. You do have differentiation, you have CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, but it's down the line. It's article, I can't recall it, it's article 20 or sorry, 12. Lionel will know better, but it's more in the spirit of Stockholm than in the spirit of Rio. Now, I wouldn't say that I mean, we need to adjust that, and the pre-project would certainly be just a pre-project for all delegates, including developing country delegates, to rewrite the pact. But the reality is that there is a lot of reluctance when it comes to formulate pure principles, or principles that very decisively aim to protect the environment. I mean, if one wants to get very legal, very technical, just look at the formulation of the prevention principle in Principle 2 of the Rio Declaration. So Principle 2 of the Rio Declaration was negotiated and, I mean, not really debated at Rio, and it was adopted as a Stockholm principle because it was Principle 21 of the Stockholm Declaration, which had been drafted very largely by the Secretariat of the UN starting in 1970. Now, that principle was only amended with 2 words. It said, in Stockholm, it said that states have the sovereign right to exploit their natural resources in accordance with their environmental policies and the responsibility to protect the environment. And here in Rio, it was stated as saying, states have the sovereign right to exploit their natural resources in accordance with their environmental and developmental policies. So that plays at the heart the issue. Look at the question of ecocide. The definition of ecocide has the environment development equation hidden inside it. So it's something intractable, it's irreducible. It's like it's a core equation that we're not able to crack. And that's, I guess, the many phases of that problem have prevented these clear statements.
Thank you, Professor. One of the issues that you've just raised, interestingly, is how other countries, perhaps in the global south, see the implementation of a global treaty on environment. So perhaps let me move to Lionel, who actually just told us a beautiful personal story of his childhood days in Lebanon. And perhaps you would like to add anything to that, Lionel? Especially, I'm thinking, can countries, especially in the global south and countries like Lebanon, actually achieve a comprehensive implementation of a global pact, given that resources are just not the same among all the countries in the world?
Yeah, certainly. It's I think the case of Lebanon is a very study case, because it shows you all the things or the problems that you have when you have an agreement that's elaborated on the international level, and then you come to the phase of implementation, which is a bit more rocky, because to have an international agreement, international treaty that's implemented in national law, well, you need the state to ratify it, you need the state to pass laws, and you need these laws to be effectively implemented. And fourth, you need these laws to be able to be controlled by a judge. So if the state doesn't respect its commitments, you take the state to court and you sue the state and you lead it to fulfill its commitments, its legal commitments. But in many developing countries, you don't have an independent judiciary that can control the actions of the government. And I think that's the main problem. It's more than just the tension between environment and development. That's very notable and very sensible in the big developing countries. But I think there's also this question of the independence of the judiciary in certain countries and the capacity of the judiciary to control the actions of the government. And you have also the capacity of governments to carry out climate targets. Because very often, you have to see how it works on the ground. You have states where the central government doesn't have control in the whole country. Well, how can you expect this government to implement a climate target in its country where it doesn't really control the country? So you see, you have all these debates that are ongoing, but thankfully, the big emitters of CO2, our governments, our states where governments have control over their country. If you look at China, the US, Russia, etc., you can say that they're really weak governments. But you can argue that perhaps the judiciary there doesn't have the power to control the actions of the government. So I'd say we should take into account these two factors. So one, the capacity of the judiciary to control the government, and two, the capacity of the state to enforce climate standards across the country.
Thank you, Lionel. Alice, it is often, I think, hard to probably imagine on a conceptual level how can you actually adopt some of these things that were just mentioned on the ground. So, for instance, how could the Global Pact address some of the issues that are very prominent right now? For example, displacement and migration, which is caused by climate change and other environmental issues.
Yes, that is a big challenge, and obviously one that, unfortunately, is not really addressed in terms of international environmental law expressly. So the issue of displacement is really a serious challenge, and the pact, I guess, if fully implemented, would really mitigate the risk, because if we fully implemented the right to a healthy, ecologically sound environment and the duty to take care of the environment, no vulnerable community would exist in terms of environmentally vulnerable if we really looked after our environment. But beyond that, there are other provisions of the pact that I guess we could lean on to mitigate these risks and reduce those vulnerabilities. And I'm thinking, obviously, around integration, the principle of integration that requires to incorporate environmental considerations in development plans, and also the measures around preventing harm and remedying any environmental damages. But also, I think it's important to empower these communities, these societies, whether they are knowledgeable about environmental issues or not, or highly literate or not, to monitor and scrutinize the activities of states and privates. And for that, I think the pact really reinforces something that Lionel touched on, which is rights to access to environmental information and public participation in environmental decision making. This is something that would help those communities adapt to environmental challenges, I think.
Thank you, Alice. I think in the interest of time, I think it's better that we move on to the Q&A. But just before we do, perhaps a last question to Lionel. How can people, perhaps in this very audience, actually help advance some of these causes? For example, the adoption of the Global Pact for the Environment.
Well, a very simple way is to join the Global Pact Coalition. So the Global Pact Coalition is right now formed of 80 partner organizations, 300 jurists and more than 1,000 individual participants. So you can just go on the website, register with us. We'll keep you posted about all the activities that we're doing to promote the pact, and that's how you could, help to get it adopted, hopefully.
Thank you, Lionel. Thank you, Professor Vinuales. Thank you, Dr. Kumpel. And thank you, Alice, for an incredible panel. With that, I would like to hand over to Helle again and to the audience.
Thank you so much. We've heard so many interesting things, and there's so many things, that you could ask about. And the wonderful thing, and I myself work on human rights too, one of the wonderful things about human rights, in my opinion, is that we're not just talking about law, we're also talking about moral principles and ethical principles, which are a part of that human rights discourse. So human rights has that the discourse of human rights has that big advantage that we can actually get some ethical, moral stuff in there too, and you've all done that here. So thank you so much. This was very, very interesting. It's now open to the floor. The idea is that there's now a Q&A for those who want to do this. And if I may, I think I would start us off by asking you about something that you haven't addressed, but is underlying, I think, much of what has been said here, the generational problem. That somehow welfare today demands one thing, but the welfare of coming generations actually demands something else. So that clash that there are often the human rights areas front is full of clashes between various peoples and various stakeholder rights and intentions and interests. So here's a real clash, in my opinion, the clash between, I see it in my own country, Denmark, for example, where the social democratic government we have is all about welfare today, but not about welfare for the future. So any thoughts? Could we open in that way? I don't know which one of you would like to start.
Thanks. I think it's a very good point, and I think that to a certain extent, maybe let me start by saying that to a certain extent, I'm very often very surprised by how many people say we need to look after our children and our grandchildren. In what world will our children and our grandchildren live? And quite frankly, the environmental problems, we are already seeing them now. We don't have to go as far as to look to our children or grandchildren. We are seeing them now. And we live in Europe, where we see relatively little of it. We do see things. We do see environmental degradation in Europe as well. But climate refugees already exist nowadays. And there are so many environmental problems that already give us problems today, especially health problems. Even in the UK, air pollution levels are so high that they cause asthma for many people. Only recently there was a case of a young girl who had finally had her had asthma recognized on her death certificate, right? So we are seeing them now. We don't need to look to our children or grandchildren to have this clash of welfare between environmental protection. That's maybe the first thing I would say to that. And then the other thing is we need to maybe reconsider what we call welfare and how we achieve that welfare. I don't think it's impossible for people to have welfare without harming the environment. But we need to reconsider, for example, rather than looking at a clash between welfare and environmental degradation, or between welfare and the welfare of our children or grandchildren, as you put it, I would look at the clash between rich and poor, for example. I don't think that we need to go as far as to harm the environment in horrendous ways to achieve welfare for everyone or to get people out of poverty. We just need to look at the privileges that rich people have and maybe take away some of their privilege and redistribute it. I don't think that there necessarily needs to be a clash, and I think that governance can or could at least solve these problems to a certain extent. There will always be clashes in society, but I think that there, at least in this particular case, I think much could be done to alleviate that clash.
Anybody else? Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it in the context of reframing what sustainability means, not just in reframing it in one way, but reframing it specifically based on who you're trying to convince and who you're trying to work with or speak to. And just for anybody listening, there's a fantastic TED Talk that was framed around how to have better political conversations, mainly in a US context, between Republicans and Democrats. And rather than trying to make your argument in the terms that you understand it or the terms that you've come to the conclusion that, yes, we need to address climate change, yes, we need to address poverty and so on, actually think, right, what are the values? What does the person on the other side of the divide really want? What outcomes do they want to achieve? What problems do they face day to day? And what problems are they going to face over the next few decades? And as the examples in that context would say, the stereotypical Republican values maybe of family and security, and actually taking the climate change argument and thinking, well, actually, why is addressing climate change important for your family and for national security? And on the other side of the coin, almost taking, say, why is, almost completely flipping it, almost why are, I'm making this up almost as I go, but why are family values, for example, a huge benefit for addressing climate change? Why is national security a huge benefit for addressing poverty, climate change, and so on? So yeah, if we can, and it's a horrendously difficult thing to do, especially when you're in the heat of the moment and having a conversation where clearly barriers have already gone up on both sides to try and sort of go around, go above, under, or somehow try and figure out and respond to what the other person is telling you and try and figure out how your argument fits into what you know they want.
Noelle, did you want to? There was one of you who wanted to.
Yeah, no, happy to come in on this and also sort of take this from a government business standpoint. So of course, one of the big challenges and concerns about establishing this right to a healthy environment is the potential kind of legal impacts on that. So, but such, the business costs of being more sustainable, because currently we're freeloading off nature, and that's not reflected adequately in economic systems. But these costs and concerns are dwarfed by the material risks and costs to businesses and governments from continued climate change and biodiversity loss. So establishing this universal right would first provide a level playing field and a clearer legal framework for everybody. So that's going to support positive actors and incentivize the laggards. And ultimately that does reduce the future risks and costs for all. And part of this is about, the basic facts are that the World Economic Forum has shown that half of global GDP is dependent on nature. A report by our own partner in Germany shows that at least 6 trillion, 3% of GDP is wiped off every year due to biodiversity declines. So there's a real cost to not managing this for businesses and for governments. But in a kind of an immediate sense, and as we look at, we push for a just and green recovery, we do need to change this narrative from the kind of job losses and the economic costs and the kind of risks and that side to the real opportunities to grasp and move forward and to invest in a more positive, healthier, fairer, more resilient world. And then, that transition is tricky. It does need investment now, before these kind of new systems and the technologies in place. But there are cost-effective things like investing in nature is very, very cost-effective. So we just need to look at the benefits and the opportunities and slightly reframe the narrative as well, I think, so that, this is better for us all in the long term. And in even businesses and governments, everybody has children. And ultimately, we're dooming them if we don't act on it now.
And that's precisely what President Biden is trying to do right now, isn't it? But he can't make Republicans listen, so that's a problem.
Yeah,
right
so
now.
it's about what the last point, speaking their language as well. So it's making this into an economic opportunity,
Right.
And that does require subsidies to be reorientated in the right place. So it does require government investment and support to move businesses in the right direction. It's not easy, but that investment is otherwise going into pandemic recovery, because we're in the situation we're in because we haven't dealt with it in advance. So it is, that investment in the right things now does pay dividends, and I think it's speaking the right languages to the right stakeholders is really key, as was mentioned.
So is there any comments from you? You've patiently been listening now for such a long time. Is there any points that you would like to raise with our panel? Any comments you'd like to make? Please, yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. My name is Adonis. I am an economist by training. So I'm going to pose the following question to you. By making a statement, if I was a firm now in a developing economy, I'd probably be a little bit alarmed by what I heard. You cannot ignore the economy. We were just talking about supply chains, and you very well pointed out that there are true costs to collecting data, instituting processes, adopting technology. If you're a small firm, you cannot take on those costs. So it might maybe creating initiatives that are good overall in aggregate, but when you think about the heterogeneity, the distributive costs, we're actually hurting developing economies. So how should I think about what I just said? Is there a case to be made about interacting ESG initiatives with the level of development of the country in which we try to put them in place?
So which one of you would like to take a go at that?
It was somewhat at me, yeah, we'll give it a go, and it's and this is not an example from a developing economy, but I think it frames quite well the problem that you've outlined. In speaking to a firm in hub of oil and gas in Texas, an oil field services company, so as the name suggests, provides oil field services for the operations of the household names, the ExxonMobils, the Chevrons, and so on. And as on board as he was with the global fight against climate change, and I think his wife was also an environmental engineer at ExxonMobil, he said, look, there is no pressure coming down the supply chain from our customers, and we're in a heavily commoditized business. We operate at a very, very low margin until our contracts and the demands of our customers, or directly from regulators, but I think they saw it more as at some point coming from their customers at the end of the supply chain. We're not going to be able to change, and we don't see it as economically feasible. I think the same thing probably applies to firms across the globe, and there are semiconductor manufacturing's another one. There's a big mini storm recently about TSMC in Taiwan, about them wildly missing their environmental goals. And although it got a bit of press, I mean, there's never going to be the incentive for them to change until the pressure comes from the companies who face the regulators and face the consumers in a firm that manufactures the phone. So and this is not really arriving at a comprehensive answer, but a combination of the end firm in the supply chain, not as sometimes happen where procurement teams are almost given the responsibility to go and quoting somebody, beat up their supply chain, actually working with them, pulling them along, figuring out how they can work together to just improve the general efficiency of everything throughout the supply chain, how they can work together to provide either the environmental improvements or the data to fulfill whatever reporting requirements the end firm might have, and then to combine that with policy. And Yeah, I think that's then a point. I think I hinted at earlier, sort of opening the question up. I mean, what is the best way to trigger that effect going down the supply chain? Is it incorporating it into, say, trade agreements, or is it in forcing companies in your own country to disclose certain aspects of or disclose to the fullest extent possible their environmental, social, and risk footprints? Yeah,
I think, Noel, you also had a comment here for this question, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's quite a lot in there. No, I mean, so yes, the cost of small medium enterprises in developing countries, there's a huge cost in having more sustainable operations, in being able to track and report on that. We don't have the data systems in place. There's a major cost to that process. But without that, basically those businesses, but particularly developing countries, developed countries, we are all, but developing countries are going to have less money to hand in order to adapt and react to climate change and nature loss. So it's an enormous risk that we have to address. So it's not really a question of this would be a nice thing to do if we could. We have to do it. So we have to find ways and means. The point of having this universal right, for example, then does step things up away from voluntary initiatives and voluntary approaches to this being towards a regulated approach. It strengthens that, which is also why there are many, there is a sort of the likes of the UK or the US are not actually that, supportive of this right, because there is potentially a cost to this. But that gives you a much better standing, a legal standing to apply this across the board. That does mean that's then a cost to businesses if they want to, not have legal cases taken against them. But then that's also where the governments come in, and so through government funding, multilateral development banks, we need to put in place the processes, and as part of that, as was mentioned, the data systems that we need to be able to track and report progress. There's a lot of investment that's needed on that side of things, but there are companies that are not keen, the laggards that I mentioned, but there are many companies, particularly the finance sector, which is really, and particularly insurers, for example. So there are particular sectors that are really pushing for this, and in fact they're pushing collectively. There's various business coalitions that are pushing for stronger targets and text in the global biodiversity framework than governments at some level. So they do see this is a risk to their businesses. And there's initiatives like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which follows on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that is working to find tools and means of reporting and addressing their nature-related risks and dependencies and impacts on nature. So there are lots of initiatives happening quite quickly to try and address this collectively and raise the bar and ensure we've got the systems in place to address this. But it has to be a bit of a push and pull on this. But having a stronger legal framework will help this, and having the government finance to support this transition is really key, and ensure that there's a limited consumer impact and impact on the most vulnerable people in terms of that transition. So yeah, quite a lot in there, but frankly we have to find a way to do this. We don't have a choice. Life will be much worse if we don't address this. We have to find ways and means.
Okay, you had something to add too, Elizabeth?
Yes, I agree. This is a huge challenge. One thing that does occur to me around government policy is I really wonder whether the principles behind the wealthier countries' foreign aid programs may need to change very considerably because the wealthy countries, I think, will need to start thinking about how to target foreign aid to developing countries in a way that supports the improvement in governance, if you like, among companies in those countries. Because if that does not happen, then the things, as Noel said, will get a great deal worse, and not just for those companies, but also for social, if you like, standards of living of the people in those countries. So one of my thoughts is that the so-called foreign aid budgets may well need to be targeted in quite a different way to the way they are at the moment.
Did you want to add anything to this, or you're fine? Good, because thank you for raising that economic angle. That is really, really obviously very important. Any other angles that we need to raise while we still have the chance? Yes, please.
Thank you for your really interesting discussions. I think the economic angle is like so vital, and often it's like one of the more tricky questions that we have to ask ourselves. I wanted to kind of ask, but also just add to the discussion on that of like, I'm from social economy, but not like financial economy. And one of the things that always strikes me about our conversation about economics and climate change is the kind of factoring in the costs of unregulated climate change and what that will lead to overall. And you know, from current predictions, they're saying it could be 200 billion to 500 billion by 2050, the impact if we don't take action on climate change. And I just wondered how that's how that's brought into our current day economic equations, because sometimes I feel like that is often missed in our economic discussions. And I also had a second point, an angle that I feel like we need to talk about. Sorry, I'm kind of like quite thirsty. My mouth's a bit dry. With the kind of international justice angle, I work in international development at the moment, and one of the questions we have to confront is that in like the very frontier markets, it's not a question of like net zero or sustainable development. It's about even having that infrastructure in the first place to survive, like, or to overcome challenges that those markets are being hit by right away. So like really remote communities in Vietnam, you know, having having mini grids and off-grid communities, they don't even have like the basic infrastructure such as electricity to survive those things. So to then ask them to develop that sustainably is putting like an even greater burden on those communities. And I just wondered from the legal perspective, how does it like deal with that nuance?
Thank you. So who wants to? Alice, please.
I might just give you some thoughts on your second question. So from a legal perspective, there are soft obligations to some extent that can be reinforced on assisting these countries to transition, and to do that, there are, you know, even in the pact, there are provisions, there's principles to help build those capabilities through, you know, transferring technology, improving education. So there is a very high-level framework for that is already in the international legal framework on environmental matters. Now, and even the Paris Agreement, you know, has financial commitments from the Western developed world to assist that transition. So the problem is, obviously, again, implementation and having a robust enough system that whereby that principle is actually translated in reality. And I think that's hopefully the discussions that will happen at the UN and beyond will try and really nail. But the principle is there. It's again the devil's in the detail, I think, from a legal perspective at a high level. So.
And I think, Jorge, did you have a raised hand? Looks like a raised hand.
Yes, happy to actually share one or two thoughts about that. So about the two questions, the ODA and the question of hard choices, essentially. Yeah? So it's the after all, that's the key consideration. I mean, the key obstacle to a transition is the cost, at least a perceived cost in some contexts, because the cost is much higher if you don't do anything. But the perceived cost, and particularly the allocation cost. So just to go to the issue that we were discussing earlier today. So imagine that you want to provide electricity to a community that is not connected to the grid. How do you do that, and to what extent you can afford to be sustainable? The short answer to that is that to provide electricity from solar PV is cheaper than to expand the grid there. Far less polluting, and you're not locking in carbon dioxide. Because that's the case, is a reality. Solar PV is the cheapest electricity in the history of the humanity, even cheaper than coal. So because that's a reality, it's an industry reality. Now you may say, well, there is another problem. There is another problem because imagine that instead of doing that, I mean, you have a government, can be UK or some other government, that is still providing official development aid to, instead of, paying for the solar panels, to pay for a coal-fired electricity facility, which is the case. So beginning of this year, I wrote a long legal opinion with a barrister from London on the obligations of export credit agencies. And the fact is that export credit agencies are financing massively fossil fuels and locking in massively fossil fuels. And so you have, for that specific person that is in that specific village waiting to be connected to the grid, so first, if the person is connected to the grid, it will be slower and much more expensive and much more polluting. Second, the actual problem of locking in all these fossil fuels, not just in that village, but in many villages around the world, will have extreme weather events and increase the risk for heat strokes and many other effects that are growing exponentially. So I'm not entirely sure what we're talking about when we talk about trade-offs. We may be talking about trade-offs in some different contexts, and there are certainly trade-offs, and that's something that I recognize. But going back, for example, to the issue of a small company that is probably producing with subsidized fossil fuels, so the electricity comes from whatever, gas, coal, something like that, and is subsidized, massively subsidized. Now, the effect of that, which is entirely understandable, I mean, if I were that person, I would be concerned about rising costs. I would certainly concerned, I would have a family, I would have employees, and perhaps a couple of employees, and these employees may be there to feed their families. But what is the effect in reality of keeping that low cost? But it may be an effect that is difficult to understand conceptually because of the complexity of the effect. But the effect may be that another person in, say, a small island nation is facing 2 hurricanes every 2 years instead of 1 every 10. And that is destroying entirely its own house and is destroying, probably killing part of the family. So, even when we think about, so let's put it in these terms, I think that part of the cost of the transition is no longer true. It's no longer true. It's as simple as that. Even if it were true, the alternative is far more costly, okay, at the global level. And even in the cases where you have issues of injustice, well, think really about what the injustice is. The injustice is not just one small company, it is also the effects on the people that are suffering the effects. So I guess that the difficulty in these issues is that not all of that can be understood by a voter or by a consumer. And because not all that can be understood by a voter or a consumer, we tend to try to present things as synergistic. Synergies, there are indeed many synergies, but the transition itself, so the process of transition, requires reallocations. Reallocations, so redistributions of power, of economic benefits, of environmental benefits. So, and that reallocation is very difficult in any context, And what we're trying to do is to conduct a reallocation, a process, a transition, which is extremely vast, and at the same time, we're trying to do it peacefully. Are we going to manage to do it peacefully? Well, that's where law comes in. Law can be helpful to do it peacefully because it preempts the reallocation, tries to strike reallocations that are acceptable, and so on. But if it's not done peacefully, what's going to happen, really? I mean, I'm not sure if people are realizing what it means, what we're facing. I'm not sure people are realizing that. So it's, and what people are already facing in many places that are more directly affected. So again, even from an ethical perspective, and from a microeconomic perspective, I don't think there is a point against a transition. From a macroeconomic perspective, I don't think there is a point against a transition. And from a justice perspective, I don't think there is a point against a transition if you think more closely. Then you have all the efforts to make it orderly, to make the best possible transition and leave no one behind. And that is a key objective. But that objective does not mean that the transition should not take place. And people don't like to realize that there are hard choices to make.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting. The thing is that we're running out of time now. So we're just about to get to our jump-off point, which means that you are free to go if you want. Conversations will be carried on. In part, we'll be going on to the. Are you going to say something about that? Go to the. No. We thought we would just move on to the to go to dinner, and so if you want to join us for that, we could carry on the conversation there. So officially, I have to declare this meeting closed, and I want to thank all of the panelists again for doing such an excellent job. I know there were more comments, you wanted to say more, but we have to finish now. So thank you so much. Should we give them a hand?
Thank you all very much for joining, especially for a 2.5-hour session. We understand that takes a lot of your attention. Thank you to everyone that's been watching online. We've had a good, consistent viewership. We will be having another roundtable discussion tomorrow online only, because unfortunately this room is not available, from 4 to 6:30, same time slot. But yeah, we're going to off the stream now, and if anyone wants to stay to talk, and we'll just sort of sit around here and have a chat, if anyone wants to. Otherwise, have a fantastic evening. Thank you all so much for coming. Cheers.